Let me invite you quickly to John 7. We're not going to spend much time here, but want to remind us of an exhortation, admonition in many respects that Jesus issued to those of his day, and obviously it extends to us by way of principle. And we're not going to give a lot of attention to the background, but we find Jesus here at the Feast of Tabernacles, and his delay to the feast had given reason for a lot of folks to question where he is, and also for them to kind of secretively speak with regards to their various opinions of him. And the reason I say that, if you go down to verse 12, John 7 and verse 12, there was much murmuring among the people concerning him. For some said, he is a good man. Others said, nay, he deceives the people. But verse 13 said that they would not speak openly of him for fear of the Jews. And so then Jesus does appear, and he provides them some encouragement with regards to hearing his message because it came from the Father, and that again prompted some response from his protagonists, and even the people here who were ignorant of what was in the hearts of the Jewish leaders who wanted to kill him. We learned that from back in chapter 5. They were looking for opportunities to kill him. Jesus mentions that here, and the people say, you're delusional. You're mad. Why do you think people are trying to kill you? But then following that, look at verse 21. Jesus answered and said to them, I have done one work, and you all marvel. Moses therefore gave unto you circumcision, not because it is of Moses, but of the fathers, and you on the Sabbath day circumcise a man. If a man on the Sabbath day receives circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry at me? Because I have made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day? Now watch his challenge. Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Jesus was appealing to them to look at things differently than how they were looking at them. This miraculous healing of which he speaks here is recorded for us back in John chapter 5. It had to do with the man who had been lame sitting at the pool of Bethesda, and Jesus healed him, but he healed him on the Sabbath day. And then instructed the man, pick up your bed. I mean, this man had been confined to his bed for decades, and he says, pick it up and go home. And the religious leaders, blinded to the supernatural work that Jesus did, found fault with the man and Jesus. And that's where we learn the Jews were looking for occasion to kill him. And Jesus said, you're not seeing things from a proper perspective. You're judging things by appearance, but you are not seeing them as you should see them. Hence, judge righteous judgment, not by the appearance. Jesus is talking about perspective, because perspective is, as we defined last week, seeing things from a specific point of view so as to understand them, so as to judge them properly. It is the idea of seeing things in their true relations to one another. And that's what Jesus is urging his enemies here. You're not judging things properly. You're not seeing them in their proper relationship as relates to the Sabbath, the restrictions that were given, and what Jesus was doing. He's trying to help them to see things from a proper perspective. As we stated last week, Jesus' perspective was perfect. I mean, He's God. He sees things as they are. And that's the reason He can judge, because He can judge things. He's perfect in His understanding, in His perspective. It's interesting, in John chapter 5, Jesus will even say that with regards to what the Father has given to Him. Verse 22 of John 5, He says, "For the Father judges no man, but has committed all judgment unto the Son." You know why? He's perfectly qualified. Not only is He God, but now He has had experience as man. And so for man now to go before God and be judged for his conduct here on earth, who better qualified than the God-man? But again, it goes back to perspective. God, Jesus, God in the flesh, has a perfect perspective. He sees things as they are and therefore can judge them righteously. But please understand, He's urging us to do the same. He's asking us to look to Him, if you will, so that we will have a proper perspective. Now, again, ours will not be perfect, but we can judge righteously. We can see things as Jesus invites us and encourages us to see them. So that goes to our current point in our series. We're talking about looking to Jesus from Hebrews chapter 12. Again, the imagery is our running a race. As Christians, we're running a race. And so the inspired penman here urges those to whom he was writing, but again, by extension to all Christians, he's urging us to run the race with patience. The idea of endurance, perseverance, because it is a marathon, if you will. It's a long-distance race. And it requires perseverance. It requires endurance, because you will grow weary. You will sometimes want to faint. You will possibly incur some obstacles or suffer an injury, but you have to persevere to the end. So how do you do that? What strategy is offered? Looking to Jesus. Verse 2. Looking to Jesus. Why? Well, first of all, because of who He is. He's the author and finisher of faith. But also because of what He has done. Look to Jesus. He finished His race. He went to the cross. He endured what He had to despite its difficulties. And now He has enjoyed the reward. He's seated at the right hand of His Father in heaven. Endure, persevere. How? Look to Jesus. Look to Jesus. And so I'm suggesting, let's look to Jesus, not only for who He is, but because of what He did. He had a proper orientation, a proper priorities, which was defined by that orientation, a proper diet and exercise. And He's inviting us to look to Him to get a proper perspective. Proper perspective. See things. As you're running this race, see things from His vantage point. See things in such a way that it will promote endurance and perseverance as you're running this race, assuring you a victory as you cross the finish line, triumphant, with the promise of receiving the crown of righteousness. So again, this idea of perspective, judge righteously, see things in their proper relationship to one another. Friends, that goes far in our having perseverance and endurance as we're running the Christian race. And so what I ask us to do under this subpoint is just think about some things that we find Jesus doing, but also in the inspired writings we are encouraged to do, that have to do with how you see things. Last week we talked about Jesus certainly did, and we're encouraged to see the invisible. And you know what allows that? Faith. Hebrews 12 comes after the great chapter on faith, Hebrews chapter 11. And what does it say about faith? Faith is the evidence of things not seen. We looked at Moses. Moses made right decisions. He judged righteously with regards to how he should react to the wrath of Pharaoh. but he saw the invisible King. He saw the invisible God. And he had far more reverence and regard and even fear of that invisible God than he did Pharaoh. He made the right decision. Friends, we're encouraged to see the invisible. Again, this is a spiritual race being run in a physical world that's going to have challenges. But we've got to walk, or if you will, run by faith and not by sight. We got to see the invisible if we're going to persevere, if we're going to endure. But very quickly, and we introduced this one last week, and again, the reason for our song before the sermon, here we are, but straying pilgrims. We need a proper perspective. We need to look to Jesus. What did he do? Jesus never lost sight of his homeland. Never. Nor can we. Friends, we need to keep a pilgrim's perspective while we're running this race. We're just here for a temporary stay. You know, there are many who live this life thinking it's the only thing. I mean, their whole existence is confined by the material. As Christians, we cannot live our lives that way. And if we choose to do so, if we get caught up in that worldview, if we get caught up in that, we're never going to persevere to the end. We're never going to finish the race successfully. We've got to keep a pilgrim's perspective. The song we sang last week, this world is not my home. I'm just passing through. Did Jesus maintain that perspective while he was here on the earth? For sure. He constantly talked about going home to his Father, returning to my Father. In fact, a kind of a mild rebuke that he gave his apostles on the night of his betrayal. Look over in John chapter, I think it's 14. Let me look at my notes quickly. John chapter 14, yes, look at verse 28. Because they're sad. Jesus is talking about, I can't be with you much longer. I have to leave. I have to go away for a period of time. And they're saddened by that. And look at what Jesus says. Verse 28, you have heard how I said unto you, I go away and come again unto you. If you loved me. You see, their sadness in many respects was driven by their selfish will to keep Jesus. Jesus says, if you truly loved me, you would rejoice. Why? Because I said I go to the Father. For my Father is greater than I. Jesus never lost the perspective. My time here on earth is temporary. Again, John 9, we have to work while it's day. The night's coming when we can't work. This is a temporary stay for me and for you. We're just pilgrims. We're just strangers. Again, Hebrews chapter 11, our primary text, chapter 12, verse 2, comes right on the heels of that. You can't separate the two. He actually makes the appeal from what he said back in chapter 11 about this cloud of witnesses. And when you go back to Hebrews chapter 11, let me invite your attention to some things that are said here by the Spirit-guided penman concerning Abraham and some of his and Sarah, as well as their descendants, Isaac and Jacob. And look at what he says. Verse 9, by faith he, that's Abraham, sojourned in the land of promise. Notice the language. He sojourned. He did it as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles. When you live in a tent, you know what that suggests? I'm going to only be here for a while. In fact, it's not long enough for me to even build a permanent structure. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they all lived in tents. They all recognized this is a temporary stay for us. But what did that really say with regards to their faith? Well, keep reading. Dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs of him of the same promise. For he, Abraham, looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So while they are here on earth, living in tents and tabernacles temporarily, all the while their focus was somewhere else. They were looking for a permanent residence. Was it here on earth? Well, just keep reading. Look at chapter 11 now, drop down to verse 13. These all, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, they all died in faith, not having received the promises. So now we know this was not earthly centered. They were not thinking about some city on earth. So what was it? Keep reading. But having seen them afar off, were persuaded of them, they embraced them, and they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country. That is, a heavenly. And wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. Friends, in many respects, we are just like these patriarchs of old. Our circumstances are exactly as was theirs. They had promises, but those promises, of which here the inspired penman alludes, were not satisfied, were not provided here and fulfilled here on earth. And that's what Abraham appreciated, which allows us to know, they must have been told a lot more about the heavenly hereafter than is given for us in the Old Testament. They must have known that. They understood there was a city. They understood my homeland is not here. I'm just a stranger. I'm just a pilgrim. I'm just passing through here. But their focus was on their true homeland. Friends, as Christians, as runners in the race, the Christian race, we have to have that mentality. We have to have that perspective. We have to see things in their true relationship. We are here for a very short period of time. And how we ought to perceive our stay is, I'm just a stranger. I'm just a pilgrim. There are numerous times that language is alluded to in the Scriptures. So we'll eventually get over to Peter. But Peter speaks of those to whom he was writing. He says, remember, you're just strangers. You're sojourners. Those are very meaningful designations. A stranger is one who lives as a foreigner in a strange land. A sojourner, a pilgrim, is one who remains in a place but a short while as a traveler in a journey. Friends, that's the perspective we got to keep. We got to keep a pilgrim's perspective as we're running. We're just passing through. And how then should that help us with running the race? Well, don't get so attached to this world. Because that's when dangers come to play in our running. We get too attached to this world, keeping us from looking to the homeland. I want to quickly take you over to Philippians chapter 3. Philippians chapter 3. Here it is not, the Apostle Paul does not use the term pilgrim and stranger or stranger, but he does again help us appreciate this idea that we are just that on this earth. Look there in Philippians chapter 3, and look at what he says in verse 20. The King James Version has conversation. Many other translations have citizenship. Sometimes, and maybe not so much in North Carolina, but in Virginia, I can appreciate this, the translation is commonwealth. See, Virginia is a commonwealth. Our commonwealth, our citizenship. Were you to look at the word in the original language, transliterated into English letters, you would see it. It's the word politics. It's the idea of where you are with regards to your politics. It's where you make your citizenship. And here is Paul saying, our citizenship is where? It's in heaven. Didn't Jesus try to impress that upon those whom he was inviting to follow him? What did he say? The kingdom of heaven is at hand. He's inviting them to become citizens of what? The kingdom of heaven. When he started teaching by way of parables, how there in Matthew 13 did he start each of those parables? The kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like. When he was on trial before Pilate, and Pilate is asking him, are you a king? And Jesus affirms, I am, but my kingdom is not of this world. And so, friends, as, quote, Americans running the Christian race, we can't recognize this as our permanent citizenship. Our greater loyalty and allegiance by way of citizenship is our being citizens of the kingdom of heaven. So where is our citizenship? It's in heaven. So what does that mean? That's where we ought to be looking. And isn't that what he goes on to explain? Read the remainder. For our citizenship is in heaven, from whence also we look for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Friends, even our King now reigns in heaven. Where should our attention be? Heavenward. In fact, if you go back, you will see that this is set in contrast to those who were styled by Paul the enemies of the cross of Christ. Look at the end of verse 18. They are the enemies of the cross of Christ. What are they like? Verse 19, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, whose glory is their shame, who mind earthly things. Where is their attention? Where is their focus? Where is their mind set? On earthly things. Next word, but for our conversation. Our conversation is not like theirs. See, the enemies of the cross are seeing things from an earthly perspective. Paul says we need to see things from a heavenly perspective. Isn't that the appeal of Colossians 3, 1 through 3? If you then be risen with Christ, set your affection on things above, not on things here on the earth. Brother Wayne Jackson authored a short commentary, but excellent. Gives a lot of attention to some of the original language, but I just want to share this with you. He says, in commenting on this verse, for our citizenship is in heaven. Paul is contrasting the attitude of the spiritual with those who are constantly thinking on earthly things. And the reason we are thinking about heaven is because from that holy sphere, we are waiting for a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. And what was the counsel of Hebrews 12:1 or 2? Look to Jesus. Where is he? He's in heaven. He's in heaven. Now, I need to look to him while he was on earth and see what he did, but now my focus ought to be in heaven. That's where my Savior is. That's where I'm expecting him to come back from. But here's one of the, again, gems that he provides from the original. He says that word expecting or looking for in the King James Version, he says it's a word, quote, that denotes the withdrawal of attention from inferior objects. See, that's why we have to keep a heavenly perspective. Because it is to withdraw our attention from that which is less important. What's that? The earthly things. I'm just a sojourner. I'm just passing through this world. I can't become too attached because this is not my permanent place. I got to keep my mind on the homeland. And I mentioned to you the book of Peter, so turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2. And again, this is but one time that Peter will use this imagery, but it's very powerful and certainly, bears on this point of why we have to be so careful of maintaining this pilgrim's perspective. Notice verse 2 and verse 11. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts. Why? They war against the soul. And remember, this is a spiritual race. We don't want things to be interfering with our spiritual perspective and to have fleshly lusts govern our stay here. That is detrimental to our spiritual well-being. I read somewhere this concept. The local church is an embassy. Y'all know what an embassy is? Every once in a while it'll come up on national news, Ricky. An embassy. It's an institution that represents one nation, although it is located in another nation. And so sometimes with warring factions going on over in the Middle East, we'll talk about the American embassy and those who are there being urged to return home. Why? Because they are there representing us, one nation representing that nation in another foreign land. And this author is suggesting we ought to look at the church like an embassy. Every embassy represents its home nation's interest to its host nation. See, we ought to be representing the kingdom of heaven here on earth. This is not our homeland. We're foreigners. We're strangers. And have you ever noticed the more that foreigners or strangers, immigrants, when they come into your land and they maintain their customs, guess what? It's easy to identify them, isn't it? Those who assimilate to American styles and diets and things like that, language, sometimes you can't even tell a person's an immigrant. But let them retain their native tongue. Let them retain their native dress. Let them retain their native diet, their culture. Guess what? It's easy to identify them. Can you see the point? As Christians, we have to be careful not to assimilate to this world. Those around us, this host nation, the world, ought to be able to look at us and say, they're foreigners. They're strangers in our land. To use a King James word, they're peculiar. They're peculiar. They look different. They act different. They talk different. They dress different. They must be foreigners. And so, thinking about that we're citizens here, we're representing the kingdom of heaven on the earth, and we're just sojourners, we're just pilgrims. I came across this excellent study of the book of 1 Peter. The church in exile. Think about it. Exile. The subtitle is God's Counterculture in a non-Christian world. Brother James Thompson obviously grew up around the 50s, and he says things have changed from the 50s. Some of us, I was born in late 50s, but maybe some of you remember those. And he's talking about, back in the 50s, guess what? You didn't have things interfering with midweek Bible class. And I actually remember that in the 70s. I was in a little league, and guess what? We didn't have practice Wednesday night. You know why? Most people were going to Bible class. Today, I go pick my mom up on Sundays after church, and you know what's going on at the sports complex? There have been sports, there have been soccer, there have been baseball going on all morning, all afternoon, all evening. See, our culture has changed. And that's what Brother Thompson is offering by way of comparison to those to whom Peter was writing. They were living in a pagan world, and now God was asking them to become holy, citizens of a heavenly nation. And guess what? That was going to bring some hardships. And he was saying for us as Christians, we used to live in a culture that was kind of Christian, at least oriented. I mean, people had regard for God, regard for His Word, they don't have that anymore. And so he said today, like Peter's day, we live in exile. It's like we are in a foreign land, representing a foreign people. And here's some things he asked. How do Christians respond to this new situation where strong Christian convictions are no longer a part of the mainstream of our society? Christians now belong to a distinctly minority group. Our behavior will increasingly be considered strange to the majority of the population. Have you encountered that yet? This new situation presents Christians with a severe test on the job, at school, and in our relationships with our neighbors. We are now discovering the challenge of being Christians when it's not popular to be Christians. He goes on to say, the alien Christians who first read 1 Peter were not strangers in their own lands because of their skin color or their nationality. That's not why Peter's saying you're strangers and foreigners. It's not because they had moved from somewhere to the Asia Minor. No, he's saying that spiritually. Their obedience to the call of Christ had made them exiles. And unlike those who are exiles because of their ethnic backgrounds, these Christians could have ceased being exiles simply by blending in with the larger population. See, there's the trial, there's the test, there's the temptation. We don't like people looking at us and saying, they're different. They're peculiar. And so we don't have to leave. We don't have to leave to get out of that uncomfortable environment. All we have to do is conform to them. But guess what we do in the process? We quit running the race. We quit running the race. And so he finally, I'll use this as my last one, because he talks about the real focus of the book of 1 Peter. There's a lot emphasis on suffering because of their decision. But he says that's not the main theme of the book of 1 Peter. The one fact about this new existence that is cause for celebration is the hope which Christians experience. And he references 1 Peter 1 and verse 4, by His great mercy we have been born anew to a living hope by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and to an inheritance which is imperishable, undefiled, unfading, kept in heaven for you. The suffering, the trials, the discrimination are only a minor chord in this epistle, for the major theme is the hope. Now listen, which places suffering in perspective. In perspective. Before any advice is given in the epistle, Peter reminds the readers of their hope. It is the one thing in this world that is permanent. See, we're just passing through. This world has nothing for us, but what we do have that's permanent in this life is hope. Hope. Look to Jesus. Remember that our true citizenship is in heaven. Keep our eyes fixed there. That's permanent. Even though we're temporary travelers here. And he goes on to finish, without the new birth, there would have been no alien existence. You know, without becoming a Christian, guess what? We wouldn't be in exile. We wouldn't be peculiar. We wouldn't be strange. We wouldn't be different and foreign. We wouldn't. Not without the new birth. But you know what? Without the new birth, he goes, but there would also have been no hope. No hope. And so I just wanted to share that with you. It's very helpful to me. Because we look at this world in which we live, we look at this culture, this environment as American citizens, and it's disturbing, isn't it? It's disturbing. So how do we respond to that? We've got to keep a pilgrim's perspective. We've got to remember we are just here temporarily. We can't be so attached to this world that we feel at home. It's not our home. It's not. We're just passing through. Our citizenship is in heaven. So I hope this was helpful. We've still got a couple more things under proper perspective, but I just hope we understand how vital it is to look to Jesus to, as he said, judge righteously. Friends, we got to have a proper perspective as we're running this race. We got to be able to, with the eye of faith, see the invisible. And similarly, we have to remember we're just here temporarily. We're running our race through this world, but we're not citizens. We're not permanent residents here. We're just having to pass through. And again, that's going to bring some challenges and difficulties because we're not like the world. And the world, I don't know, they're troubled by that. They like conformity. Now, they speak tolerance, but you know what? That applies to everyone but Christians. Because they think we're intolerant because we're different. And they say, well, you ought to be tolerant of everyone else who's different, but they're not tolerant of Christians. And that's why, sadly, it's like we're living in exile. We're not in our homeland yet, but that's our hope. That's our hope. Let's keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, and if our eyes are fixed on Jesus, you know where he is? He's in heaven. That's where our eyes will be. And it is for that reason that I selected the song, Hilltops of Glory. I love it. It's the idea that we're ever getting closer. Each day we're praying to be on a plateau that's higher, getting us closer to heaven and further away from this world. That allows for a proper perspective in this world. Keep trying to reach a higher plateau. Heaven is clearer and sooner on the horizon than it's ever been.